morning, church. It is good to be together this morning. Happy 25 years, Porch City Community Church. It truly is a gift to be together on this day, and just the 9 o'clock gathering right before this was incredibly special. And we're really beginning a week-long journey of celebration today. And there are so many things on the horizon that you heard about just a few moments ago that we're going to use this week to celebrate what God has done over the past 25 years, a quarter of a century together as a church. And today the stage does look a little bit different because we're going to be able to hear from some people that have been here since the very beginning and that have come along the way, and to hear from their perspective, and for us together as a church to practice remembrance together as the people of God as to how God has been faithful to us and what God is going to continue to do in the life of our church. I think it's going to prepare us really well for that. But when you think about, there weren't very many people around when our church began. There was just a few people, and one of them was our lead and founding pastor, Mike Ashcraft. So as Mike comes to the stage this morning, can we just take a moment as a church and honor him for the faith that he has exemplified and that he has chosen at each step along the way. Michael Wayne Ashcraft, come on to the stage. Can we honor him together this morning? Yeah. Grab a seat on the couch, Mike.
I'll get a seat. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. You would tell me to just receive it. So just receive it, Mike.
I know.
I know that you don't look for that and that you're not hungry to be celebrated, but I do celebrate you and your faith and the way that you have genuinely led our church toward Jesus for 25 years. What might even feel like longer than that because of the lead up to launching the church. It didn't just pop in out of thin air.
Yeah.
And today, I just want you to know that our church is grateful for you and that we're really proud of you. And I didn't get to say this morning at the 9, but I'll say it now. You are the same. You stand right there a lot. And I was going to do the math on how many messages you've preached. But I forgot, to be honest with you. It's just appearing to me now. That was an idea that I forgot to do. But let's just say it was a lot. It has been a lot. And you've done it so faithfully. But you're the same person right there as you are at home and in everywhere in between. And I'm really, really grateful for that. So can you take us back really quick to the thought of starting Porch City Community Church? And that sounds really clean, but I would imagine that it wasn't maybe that clean. What was that like? What came into your mind? What do you feel like God was leading you to do?
You know, it was a gradual understanding. I wanted to be a youth minister for my life. And I'd gone to, this is before Google or social media or the internet was just starting. So you didn't have if you wanted to see what another church was like, you had to order a VHS tape from them. They would send it to you in the mail, and you would watch it on your video recorder.
VHS.
Yeah,
can you define
video,
that?
like a videotape you put in this machine. And because you would read, you could find certain things here and there, but wasn't readily available. And I had gone to a particular church, and I saw their just focus on helping people. And I was a youth pastor, and most of the kids in my church, in our youth group, their families didn't go to our church, and so their parents didn't go to church. I got to know a lot of them, and I realized that most people who didn't go to church, they weren't atheists. They had questions that no one would really seem to bother with. It was like everything was so certain. And my own journey, I always grew up thinking it was doubt, and it was really curiosity. And I just always felt like a bad Christian, or like I didn't have enough faith, because I just always had questions about how could God do these things, or how could this be like this? And what I learned was in those early days was that, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. It's when we try to create these things that are so hard and fast that we remove the capacity to have to trust or believe or wrestle. And so when we started Porch City, it really was, how can we just help people take steps? And that was how it started. It was just that sort of heartbeat. Could we be helpful to this person or that person? It was just very individual. I remember sitting at the coffee shop, and I was just thinking about this. It's been probably 30 years ago now, 28 years ago now. and just thinking about what if we had a place that could help, just kind of create a scenario for this person walking in the coffee shop. Maybe she's got a kid who's struggling with something, or maybe this couple's struggling in their marriage, or maybe this guy's got some addictive patterns, and I said, what if we could just help? What if we could just be helpful to them? Yeah. And if we could create a place where that was the case. And that was the drive and the heartbeat. That's where the mission came from. As you write these things down and you don't have any way to know if it's going to work. Right. Or if it's going to become something. And so it's just, I remember just, you're hoping, but it's like behind that hope is terror. You're just afraid. Yeah. And everything that doesn't go the way you think it should go, or it's not a clear open door, you go, I shouldn't be doing this. And that was what it was like in the early days. Some of those things are still there today. It doesn't get less scary to live in a way that hopefully is faithful to God.
Yeah. Well, I just commend you for that. And I think that when you think about a place like this, you say it often, it looks like we have it all together because of the building, or because of the systems, or because of the teams, and all of those things are beautiful. And we are so blessed to have so many great people and great places. But you didn't start by idolizing success and just trying to be successful as much as you sought to be helpful and to be faithful ultimately to what God was calling you to do.
And people would ask in the early days, especially because there was like two big churches, like Willow Creek or Saddleback or North. They would ask you, "What model are you?" And it used to make me so crazy because I'm like, we're not a model. Like we're not just taking a cookie cutter system from something we've read or some conference we went to and then overlaying it and try to execute it. We're trying to understand what God is doing in our particular place. Yeah. I was 29 years old, so I didn't know this super well. I'm just trying to, but I knew that wasn't what we're supposed to be doing. And I do remember early on as the church began to grow, I can tell you sincerely, we have never concerned ourselves with how to be big. What we have concerned, when there was we were preaching at Rolling Rice and there was 55 or 85 or 100 people in Rolling Rice. There's 720 seats in there. So this is sparse, people just here and there. I remember thinking our job isn't to get big. Our job is to understand how can we be a great steward of what God has entrusted to us. When people show up, I don't care if it's 5 or 50 or 5,000, when they show up, they have trusted us with their time and with their attention and with something that is inclined toward what God wants to do. And we had better take that seriously and figure out how to steward that way. That's where all the organization, and a lot of it's not even my idea. We've been able to find great people, but a lot of the organization, the systems, the reason they're there is to make sure we can do what we say we're gonna do, to be great stewards of people that God has entrusted, the movement that God has entrusted to us.
That's so good. Well, I think the headline of the story is the faithfulness of God. When you look back at you desiring to lead a church and to start a church and your hope to be helpful and to reach people and help them walk with God. So if you have your Bible today, let's go to Joshua chapters 3 and 4. I think that it gives us an anchor for our conversation today in a lot of ways, because it's the story of Joshua becoming the leader of the people of Israel, and Moses has since passed away. He was the leader of them throughout the 40 years of them being in the wilderness. And you often probably think about the correlation between being in the wilderness and starting a church and feeling a little bit lost and relying on daily bread to be the oxygen of the church. I think that is part of the story. But then you see in the
just
first...
one fun fact, sorry to interrupt. I didn't say this earlier, but when we started the church, I remember this very vividly. Our budget requirement for the month was $2,407. And that's what we needed to keep the doors to pay all our bills. And our first budget receipts were $2,412. We had $5 to spare.
Oh, I can't do math.
That's all right. But because it was so hand to mouth and so precarious all the time. Like you just were always like one Sunday away from ruin. That's what it felt like all the time.
And you
For
said,
years.
you said that you agreed that you could quit in 20 years if no one was coming.
Yeah, when we were starting out, because things would go well and then things would go terrible, and then things would go okay and then would go terrible again. And I remember thinking, okay, if I want to quit every time something doesn't go right, that's going to be like every 2 days, and that's not sustainable.
Somebody needs to hear that today. Right. Somebody wants to quit.
So I had to decide, like, okay, when you start something, what's going to be the thing that makes you quit? Like, when do you have permission to quit, to say this didn't work? And so I just wrote down in my journal that if nobody's coming after 20 years, then I can quit. And what it did was it just gave you a frame of reference that no matter what happened, you were just going to keep going because it wasn't 20 years, and it was just a way to kind of give me a resolve to refuse to give up.
Refuse to give up. Well, I think that's actually what we see in the story. So the people of Israel, they haven't given up. God keeps leading them. They want to give up. They want to go back to Egypt. But it all leads kind of to this moment of their entering into the promised land in Joshua chapter 3, beginning in verse 15. And they've got to cross the Jordan River. And this is what happens. It says, now the Jordan is at a flood stage, all during harvest. And yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark, referring to the Ark of the Covenant, reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. Yep. And it's this miraculous moment of God's perfect provision for them, but they had to put their feet in the water. Yep. And I think about that through the lens of what you and the early church leaders that had been around in those days, you were constantly putting your feet in the water saying, God, we're depending on you. Like we are wholly and completely dependent upon you to move in the life of our church. Yeah. And I love that that hasn't changed. Yeah. Like sitting here today, when we think about the future and we think about all that is to come, I feel like we still sit in that place of we're just dependent. But then what comes next, jumping down to chapter 4, through verses 4 through 7, you actually see that Joshua calls 12 men. He had appointed them from the Israelites and one from each tribe. And he said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. And when it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. And these stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. And you have a stone today, like a physical stone.
It's a rock.
It's a rock.
Stone.
That serves as a reminder for you because of where it came from.
Yeah, I want to say two things before. So the idea of putting your feet in the water, that's like Moses or Joshua had known of the crossing of a body of water before. Moses stuck a staff in the water, in the sand, and the water parted and everybody walked through. And this time, God required them to get into the water. And what's interesting, when we were starting a church, there was nobody who was looking forward to coming to Port City Church on Sunday because it was not a thing. Right. So everything that you do is something that hasn't been done yet, and you have to. That's what it feels like. It feels like you're always like hoping that something is going to occur. Yeah. And so when we were, what this is about is when we got, and this story is from that. When we got to, we were in Rolling Rice, and we were also in Mayfair movie theater. So we had a temporary or portable location in Rolling Rice. We set up there, and simultaneously set up in Mayfair, Mayfair theaters. And so it's two set up and tear down locations, and it was absolutely nuts. And the school wants us out. They're like, you guys have got to get out of the school. You're just too big. You've been here too long. We got to get you out. We don't have anywhere to go. So we had lost about $250,000 on a deal. We were trying to buy a building out in North Chase. We had tried to buy property in Castle Hayne. We had been everywhere, couldn't find anything. And miraculously, we end up with this land. And so we had this deal fall through, lost a bunch of money. And we had a board meeting on Sunday night to announce, hey, we lost the deal, we lost the money. So everybody's like really sad, which is an understatement. And I said, we need to take Tuesday, we need to fast and pray. So everybody go, take lunch, go fast, go pray, and ask God, right, for direction. Like we got to have something. And I was reading 1 Samuel, which is Hannah is praying for a child. And Hannah's out by the temple, and she's praying in such a way that the priest thinks she's drunk. So I went over to Randall Parkway, over by the college. It was all woods. And I thought to myself, I said, if a police officer walked up to me, what would cause him to think that I was drunk? And I said, I'll lay in the ditch. So I'm not like a charismatic guy, but I got in the ditch on my face.
Do you recommend that?
And I did. And I prayed the exact prayer Hannah said, Lord, if we have found any favor in your sight, would you give us a piece of property? And I added this tagline that developers in our area would wonder how a church got it. And I prayed and I got up and I went back and I was writing this down and recording this in my journal. I also added, I said, could you let me know by Friday? Because we have a board meeting on Sunday and we have services and it'd be a lot easier to preach without an upset stomach if we know what's going on. I'm not kidding. I go into my office on Friday. There's a real estate agent in my office. She said, there's a piece of property for sale. Nobody knows it's for sale, and I can get you in front of the owner. We get in front of the owner. He says, I'll sell you the property on 3 terms. Number 1 is that I'm not going to give you a deal. You're going to pay full price on it. Number 2, you can't make it public until you close. So you can't let anybody know that you're negotiating this until we close on the property. And number 3 is I'll give you 180 days to close. Now, the property was at $4 million. So I was like, we'll do it. And so now you got to figure out how you're going to raise $4 million without telling people that you're trying to raise $4 million. It's very difficult to do. And so we got some of our board members and some of our staff. We came over here to this about 20 yards from where I'm sitting right now. And I sat on my knees and I prayed. And I reached over because I had this story. I grabbed this rock. I said, one day, we're going to tell a story about this rock. And I've kept this on my desk as a reminder that God can do things that we cannot even begin to calculate. And so don't spend a lot of time trying. And that's why this sits on my desk and why it means. Because and even today, what we're doing is I'm a future guy. I don't love to just sit and cherish things, which I probably should do better. But this is a chance for us to go back into the river. Yeah. We're not going to just keep rushing ahead. We're going to go back into the river. We're going to grab some rocks, and we're going to remember, and we're going to set up a monument so that when our children look and say, what happened? We're going to say, this is what God did. That's what we want to do today.
That's so good. All right, well, let's do that in the way that we look back and remember what God has been doing in and through our church. So Olivia and Rick, would you guys come up to the stage? Olivia, we can welcome them. Olivia, you started leading worship here when there was no here. You were 17 on the day that the church started, but you were in Mike's youth group, which I always give Mike a hard time. It feels like every person that I meet that has been around Wilmington for a long time is like, I was in Mike's youth group growing up. I'm like, how big was this youth group?
I just went to the high schools every day, and so I thought that was our youth group.
There's a random guy eating high school lunch. And then
you would come once, and you would be part of the youth group.
Perfect. Oh, perfect. And then, Rick, you came to the church in 2002.
Spring of 2002.
Spring of 2002. You started attending. You came on the board of directors. You came off the board of directors, and then Mike convinced you to come on staff here at our church, and you still are on staff. And you, a lot of times, are the guy that Mike quotes on Sundays. And
we joke that I'm the person that I can quote Rick without giving him credit and it not be counted as plagiarism.
It's not plagiarism. It's just one of those things. If you know, you know. But Olivia, before we jump to Rick, can you take us back to that first Sunday where we thought, and I was 3, so I wasn't thinking much.
Thanks for that.
But what were you guys thinking going into that first Sunday?
So we'd been meeting in homes for a few months at that point, and we were very prepared in that we had practiced. I was leading worship. We had practiced our songs. We were going to hit them with a Stephen Curtis Chapman song to start everything
and everybody
off.
was going to get saved again.
Yeah. Right. We were, there was so much anticipation, and the week leading up to Sunday, there's a hurricane coming. And so we had a sign, we had equipment of some sort at that point.
I did.
We were ready, and then the storm is coming, and how do you cancel something that hasn't even started yet? And so we didn't know what to do with that, but I think we called the news. Mike called the news to tell the world that we were going to postpone our services. And there was the news would run a little ticker at the bottom that said, the offices of Port City Community Church are closed, which we didn't have offices.
That said, Port City Community Church cancels services tomorrow.
Right.
Yeah, and so we called them to tell them that because I remember thinking, because we could have called everybody, it was like 20 people. I said, hey, we're not having service tomorrow, it would have been fine. But I was like, let's call it. So we were all sitting around and we're watching this. We had rented a house. My parents were here and Krista's parents were here. We were all here. And so we were watching this and we knew the service was canceled and there was a hurricane coming. And so we called the news and we all sat around. I'm pretty sure we had a VCR. We put the tape in and we recorded it. And it rolled across. It said Port City Community Church cancels its services. And we just cheered. Because it was the first time we'd ever seen like the name of this thing that hasn't happened yet. Yeah. In a place that we didn't generate or create. So it was like you're grasping at anything to make it legit, right?
But I do think that you were huddled up together because you were expectant for what God was going to do. Yeah. You didn't know what it was going to look like, but you were undeterred because you were just excited because the name of the church is now on the ticker, which probably made it feel real.
It did.
And I think that does lead to the idea when you have a posture of expectation, even a storm can incite faith. Like even difficulty, even adversity can build your faith, can stir up your faith if you've got a posture of expectation that God is more powerful than what you're currently looking at. Right. But Olivia, can you take us back to that next Sunday? The church finally gets up off the ground, and I would imagine it's chaos. What does that feel like?
Yeah, it's chaos. It's chaos and just sheer terror. We didn't know if anybody was going to show up. Yeah. We were kids. I was a kid. I would say Mike was still borderline kid. We just didn't know. It was sheer terror, but I think expectant is a great word. We were expectant. We knew that the Lord was moving and there was an energy that was there, that was in the room, that was among the people, and we'd see a new face and we were like, we're doing it. Yeah. Like but he's doing it. People are coming, and there was an expectation that we were expecting the Lord to show up, and he did.
He did.
Yeah. So when you think about you came to our church as a kid, and now you have a kid, or you have three kids.
Three kids
in our church.
Yes.
What's that like?
It's great. So like Mike was saying, I've known him and Julie since I was 10, and when I was 12. Mike came up to me and was like, "Your parents are singers. You could probably sing. Do you want to sing?"
So that was the audition process.
In the band?
Very strategic.
And I was like, "I guess so." So I was 12 when I started leading worship, for in the youth group, and I have a 12-year-old now. I have a 12-year-old son. And so it's so interesting, my walk and my growth as an early believer was grown in Port City, and now he is doing that as well. He's in Tsunami. His walk is developing. He prays. It's so interesting as a mom that you pray with your kids, and then at some point they start praying themselves, and that's such an interesting turn. And to be a part of this as a kid, and now it's continuing in the next generation. Mike always talks about the next generation, and and that concept of looking forward. That's been a mindset that has been throughout the years here at Port City, is just like constantly thinking about the next generation and what's happening next. And it's happening. I was that kid, and now I'm an adult, and I have a kid who's doing the same thing.
Yeah, and you think about, it's like the church was started, by a bunch of kids who believed that God was going to move. And hearing you articulate, which I wish we had time today to hear some of the stories that came in those first couple of years about learning how to do children's ministry and learning how to do a parking lot and like learning how to build teams. And I remember the other day you were just speaking to the fact that like y'all didn't know what you were doing, but you kept following closely. And I think that when you think about it, it's like just because you don't know what you're doing doesn't mean that God isn't working. And I think if we can be reminded of that, we can be emboldened in our faith to continue taking steps toward him. And then you just think about your intersection with this, Rick. You come into the fold. You've lived a little bit everywhere at this point. How many, you said you moved 7 times?
Yeah, this was our 7th stop.
7th stop
Yep.
into married life, moving around the country. And you come into Port City. What about Port City made you say, this is gonna be church for Liz and I?
Yeah, in each of those 7 stops, we had learned that the church really needed to be a hub for our family. That was like priority 1 whenever we moved to a place was, what's the church? Where are we gonna belong? Where are we gonna jump in? And so we just made that a priority when we got here. And we looked and looked and looked. And we had just come out of a mission organization. We'd been there for several years. And somehow we found Port City. And we actually didn't show up the first time to Roll and Grice. We showed up to the offices on Shipyard Boulevard.
Perfect.
And
Was
I
it
still
midweek?
remember.
Was it midweek?
Yeah, it was midweek. And I still remember it was Ovella Tippett that welcomed me and opened the door for me at the offices. And it just was like anytime you go to a church for the first time, they're like, oh, we're glad you're here. But this was more than that. This was like a genuine enthusiasm that we were there, and we were just scooped right up and welcomed in.
Do you think that could have had anything to do with that you were an adult
He
at the
was an
time?
adult.
Like,
Maybe.
because I've heard they were in desperate need of adults.
Really needed
We
in
needed
that
some
moment.
adults with jobs. That's what we needed.
Yeah, they
Real
could give a little
jobs.
income.
Real
Yeah,
jobs.
I'm learning something right now.
What is funny though, so when I met Rick, because it was the same thing, it's like, why would he come to Port City? Because when I met, so Rick is very understated, and I don't want to brag, but very intelligent, very smart.
Yep.
His chemical engineer says he had worked, he had a really good job. And so we went to PT's on Fountain Drive, and we're having lunch, and I'm like, and he had a missions organization he's running and doing work in Mongolia. And I'm like, why do you want to come to Port? Like, I couldn't figure it out,
Yeah.
you know? And in my mind, I'm just like, if we can get this guy, like, he'd be super helpful. And that was always my approach from the time I met you in 2002. And then I just put on my list, I'm gonna try to figure out how to get this guy on staff at some point in time.
Well, and Rick, you proved to be very helpful, because I know of the quote, I wasn't there, but in the board meeting that centered around purchasing this property. Yeah. And we heard you kind of describe this just a few minutes ago, Mike, where you guys need a place to go, the pressure's on, you're on the board, Rick, and you're looking at all these options, and all these options are not working out. It's setback after setback after setback. $250,000 worth of a setback.
That's a lot.
Can we just think about the gravity of that for a minute? And then this property becomes available, and the question becomes, how are we gonna pull together $4 million without already telling anybody in 180 days? Right. And you looked at everybody in the room and you said, God's asking us for the faith of the $100,000 check to send that in for the earnest money. He's not asking us for the full faith of the 4 million yet. He's just asking for us to take a step. And I just can't help but wonder what that formed in our church. It wasn't just about buying property, I think it was God teaching us some things. And can you speak to that a little bit? What did you see God form in us as a result of that decision of faith?
Yeah, you describe it well, Carson. We've been sort of reflecting over the last 25 years, and that period has come up. And I can physically feel the same way I felt in that meeting.
Yeah.
We were, as Mike described, we were like being pushed to do something, but there was nothing to do. Like, we just kept, everything we explored, we lost money. And, our bank account was getting low. And so we're in this meeting, and it's like, do we have the faith to think that we could raise $4 million without telling anybody? And, there are just these times when you feel like you're supposed to say something, but you really don't want to say something because it's going to sound like an idiot in front of all the people around you. And I just really felt like God was saying, look, the next step of faith isn't the $4 million, it's the $100,000 of earnest money.
Right.
And the first confirmation that might have been God's voice was everybody else in the room just said, yeah, I think that is the next step of faith.
Yeah.
And so how did that form us? It certainly formed me. It gave me like a big a big thing to look back to and say, look, I didn't take that step of faith. We didn't take that step of faith because it felt comfortable.
Right.
I can still feel the angst around that time. But God just proved himself faithful, and that was just one more time over many times where God has shown himself faithful.
Yeah, so fast forward to y'all decide we're going to do this.
Yeah.
And then Mike
sends he jokes around like he's like, this might be the last thing we ever do as a church.
No, I videoed it because I thought it might be the last thing we do.
Because $100,000 was like 2/3 of what we had in our checking account.
It was significant.
Yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah,
significant.
It was 2/3 what we had.
So it's like when you look
so we
back.
had lost $250,000, and now we're down. So we're down $300,000 out of probably $500,000 in very, very short period of time.
So by
with
all
the payroll and
natural terms, that felt probably a little bit foolish. Like it could be foolish, and I think terrifying. Right, like that's the other theme. If you were to live faithfully, then get ready to sometimes live in the unknown. Yeah. But I think what we can learn from that is what feels foolish now can be a story of faithfulness later. Yeah. Because fast forward to the next Sunday, no one knows about what's happening with this contract, and then what happens.
We used to take the offering in these little picnic little baskets we passed around rolling rice, and it would be like just like wads of dollar bills and $5 bills, a few checks, and so we meet on Sunday. We agree to sign the contract. I sign the contract and fax it over Thursday or Friday, and then the Sunday in the morning we get the offering, and there's a wadded up check. And we open it up, and the check's for $96,000, and we literally, it was almost like God said, because we really felt like that this was a make or break for our church. Like we weren't going to make it if this doesn't pan out. Mm-hmm. And it was just such a thing for God to just do, to just go, it's going to be okay. Yeah. Like I can be trusted. And that I think is what it did in our church for all the things that were to come in the next decade. Yeah.
Okay, so let's bring Bobby and Holly Campbell to the stage because they come into the life of the church. The Overflow crew is at the 11 this morning.
They serve at the Overflow. They love that's so good.
Holly and Bobby are a spiritual mother and father to so many of our 18 to 25-year-olds, and I'm so grateful that you are just willing to say yes to all the things that we're pulling you into these days. But you guys come to the church in fall of 2006, right? And that's around the same time all of this pressure is descending upon all these big decisions for the future of the church. What led you guys to Port City? Like what made you show up at Rolling Rice Middle School to try out Port City Community Church?
Well, that is a funny story because we weren't looking for a church. But we, at the time, Bobby and I were working together in his office, and we had a friend that worked alongside of us named Ren. And Ren, if you're in the room, thank you so much for the invitation to come to Port City. Yeah. But she just kind of casually observed how much we loved music. And so she just one day said, as we were sitting beside each other, as much as you and Bobby love music, you should come to my church sometime and hear the music. Yeah. And I'm so glad that she phrased it that way, because I think if she hadn't have said it that way, we might not have come, because we didn't, again, we weren't church shopping. Right. We were in this phase where we were very content to attend church on Sunday morning. We were attending another church, and we would go for an hour and walk out the door and go on with the rest of the week. And that was the extent of our faith. It didn't carry over into our lives really more than that. Yeah. And at the same time, we were in this very complicated and difficult season and getting through that by our own strength, which is exhausting, right?
Yeah, no question.
So anyway, we show up at Port City in December of 2006. We've been talking about this week, and we immediately pull into the parking lot at Rolling Rice, and we're met pretty immediately by the parking team. Yep. And that welcoming, that invitation to come on in, we've got a place for you, just continued as we got our daughter checked into the to children's ministries, which we didn't know was called Grow Zone. You know, we were so, again, just coming to check out the music. And, but everybody was so helpful and so welcoming and made it easy for us to find a place there. And so I really, again, remember just thinking, we're not looking for a church, but it just genuinely feels like this church is looking for us. Yeah. And again, that sentiment continues today. And I think that's a real picture of the heart of God. You know, as you're greeted on Sunday mornings here with open arms, our Heavenly Father has open arms towards us. But anyway, we got into the auditorium and it was dark and the band was up front and we were ready to, you know, do what we came for, hear the music. And I will just never forget, you know, we were coming from a traditional church and the music there was quite different, but I will never forget one of the songs that we sang early on was a Matt Redman song called You Never Let Go. And in that song, he very passionately, towards the middle of that song, sings these lyrics. And lyrics have always spoken to me. That's probably why Ren said, come hear the music. Yeah. But anyway, he says, I can see the light that is coming for the heart that holds on. There will be an end to these troubles. But until that day comes, still I will praise you. And I remember just looking around and feeling like these people are singing that with all their heart, and they look like they fully believe it, and I fully believe it. Or I want to, you know, I want to step into that too. I want that for myself and for Bobby. And you know, you add to that then that Mike then started talking about if God created life, He alone gets to define it, and that meant our faith needed to go beyond Sunday. Yeah. And praise God, because, you know, we're celebrating 25 years of the church, and it's so awesome to hear of God's faithfulness. Yeah. But I can't help but think, because of the transformation I've seen in my own life, I can't help but think that means 25 years of heart transformation for a whole lot of people.
Yeah, that's so thank you. And you think about what you're referring to in the sense of that was not an easy time for you or for Bobby or your whole family and your community around work at the time. Bobby, can you give us a little bit of a window into what's happening beneath the surface of your life when you walk into the parking lot that day in December of 2006? And then what was the result of that?
Yes. In our family, we had a couple of deaths. I had a grandfather pass away. We had a dog pass away. Our daughter spent a few days in the hospital with rotavirus. So some of those kind of things were going on. Yeah. But one of the biggest things was my business partner in my orthodontic practice, who was a great mentor to me, someone I looked up to and really depended on for kind of like our income, really. He was battling leukemia. Yeah. And so in the summer of 2006, he was not doing well and decided to go out to Seattle for a stem cell transplant. And he was gone at the time when we first walked into Port City in Seattle getting treatments. Unfortunately, he passed away in March of 2007. So kind of around the time when we were starting to come, Dr. Craig, my mentor, and just a great, awesome guy, he passed away. So that was an undercurrent of our thing that we were dealing with at the time, really. Right. But coming to church, I'm going to give Mike a lot of props here for...
Go for it.
You know, for...
Make him squirm.
Yeah. So we came, like Holly said a minute ago, we came from traditional church. And I noticed one of the things that y'all used to pass out at Rolling Grace were the, bulletins or whatever you want to call it. And it would have some scripture on there, but also had a place for notes. And I'm like... I've never taken notes in church before, so maybe I should start doing that. So I started bringing a pen and started taking notes, kind of on his promptings. And then it was right around the time when I think the first My One Word series came out, was that first 2007 January. So sure enough, I said, I'm going to try to pick a word. So I picked a word.
Perfect.
And then he talked about journaling, and I actually went out and bought a journal. And I looked over that journal before this and looked back at the first entry, and it said, well, I can't believe I'm actually writing in a journal.
Yeah, I love it.
But someone thinks it's a good idea, so so I started writing.
Yeah.
And processing through the messages, and at the end of the message, Mike would give us homework or questions about the topic at hand. And so, from a practical standpoint, all those little things, had impact on me. And at the time, I probably didn't realize how much impact they had. But sitting here 18 years later,
huge.
It's huge. So for me, it was just a lot of small little steps in the right direction, like Mike's talked about lots of times. Volunteering, jumping in, getting involved with different ministries. I've been on the parking team several times. I've done a bunch of different ministries throughout our time here, but in every season of that, it's always looking back on it. I've always learned something from whether it's Tsunami or Fuse Camp or whatever it might have been.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think that it's so beautiful because the mission of the church that is established in 1999 to reach people and help them walk with God rings true for you at the end of 06, going into 07, and the time where you desperately needed to be reached and that you desperately needed to be helped. But you didn't leave it there. You picked it up, and you now treat the mission of our church personally in the way that you extend yourself and the way that you give yourself away to other people. And Bobby, I've not had a chance to ask you this, but we joined the parking team on Tuesdays. No pressure. You could say yes later, but I love your heart for our church and your commitment to what God is doing here, and you serve as a really beautiful example for that. Two more people I want to bring into the conversation really quick. Javi and Clay, you guys can come up. We can welcome them to the stage.
Hey, while they're coming, can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
So one of the things that this is something that we all have to really pay close attention to, because we often think that there's something big that needs to happen for us to become like what God wants us to be. And I've known Bobby and Holly for a long time, and this first time I've really processed this, but what you do see is like it's literally the next step that you take in hoping, believing, and trusting that God is leading you and calling you and with you, that begins to do and unfold things that you can't fathom. And so I say that to encourage you here, because you're hearing this and it sounds like this is literally what you are in is a culmination of tens of thousands of small, what seemed like insignificant steps at the time when they were taken. There were very few massive moments.
Yeah.
And so I encourage you, because some of you here, most of us here, know something that we could do to process or think or consider, and Carson's going to give us a couple in a minute. If you do that, and you do that consistently for the next 3 months or 6 months or 12 months, to think about what you might see and experience and know, and more importantly, what you might become. So that to me is just such a great picture of what we're all trying to do. So thank you guys for sharing that.
That's so good.
Even I know there's been times when you've made calls to jump into a different ministry, and you say, you might not feel like you're prepared or adequate enough to do this. Sure, you're right. You don't feel that way. You just got to go do it. And even when it comes to processing and reading and learning, you still sometimes feel, am I doing this right or not? You know what I mean? But it's a step.
That's why my journal is just like yours. I can't believe I'm writing in my journal. Like, it's the same thing. It really is.
Well, and it's just one step at a time. And we have learned that as a church consistently throughout the history of our church of how to slow down and see the very thing that's right in front of us. And I think we as a church learned that in a really beautiful way in 2018 during the aftermath of Hurricane Florence. And Javi, when did you start coming to Port City?
I came to Port City in spring of 2003. It was the first time, but it was like 2008 when I was I was in.
Okay, so seed gets planted in 2003. It starts to produce a harvest in 2008, and I'm here to tell you it still is producing a harvest. Because as the pastor of community engagement, you do an incredible thing for our church and for our community in helping our church be mobilized into the community, but also helping the community get into the center of the heartbeat of our church. What did you see grow in our church as a result of how we gathered in the community in a lot of ways and how we served in the community in those days after Florence?
Well, I would say, it's a storm, right? Another storm that was upon us. But I think one of the neat things that we were able to really experience was almost like Peter, like you had to just get out the boat, right? Just trust what God was going to do. Even in the midst of uncertainty. We just were taking one step of faith at a time, just getting to know our community. We were going out into the community and getting to know people where they were at. There was a lot of physical needs, but also we saw a lot of spiritual needs in our community, and that was a way for us to really be able to step in and just love our community in such a deeper way.
Yeah, and I just think about the ways that is still changing our church in so many ways, and the way that your team has developed Encounter the City, and the way that we get to go and see. And I know you said that to Mike one day during lunch of Mike, what do you see? And I think that is an invitation for us, even through the text today of Joshua 3 and 4. It's what do you see? What does the rock represent? And what is God wanting you to do in light of that? And I love how you have led us toward that so faithfully. And Clay, I think that when you sit in the seat that you get to sit in, you get to zoom out a lot. And you've been here since the very beginning. What do you see today in our church that's the same? But also, what do you see that's different?
I see so much that has changed. And I see so much that has remained the same. And what do you do with that? Right? As I've been processing and thinking, what has happened? I think the best way I could sum it up is I think we have matured. And maturity is not about knowing everything or having it all figured out. I don't know adults in the room, any of y'all that have it all figured out. But we mature, right? We grow in this process. And I think maturity really is it's a deepening in what is most true of you. And that's what happens to us as adults. We deepen the things that are true of us. And that's what I see. Even just hearing this conversation this morning at the 9 and now getting to participate again, it's the things that were values of us as a church in the beginning are still values today. And yet God has allowed us to go deeper in them. And when I think back to the early days, I think earlier it was described as a beehive at one point, but it was a movement. Port City was a movement much more than an establishment. And it was you were just trying to keep up with what was happening. It was you were riding this wave and you just got to stay on the wave, keeping the momentum. And it is a beautiful, I think the church is actually meant to be a movement, right? It's a move of God through the people of God. And yet I think one of the temptations of a movement is that we often want to make it a machine. We want to take what once was organic and is happening and make it controllable, predictable, repeatable. And so we, develop systems and structures and programs. And I think for us as a church, I think we sat in that tension for years. I think God allowed us to sit in that tension for years. And we got really good at building ministries, which is awesome. We got really good at putting on programs, which is awesome. But the difficulty there is that you can lose sight of people. And I'm just so thankful that it was God's faithfulness, I think, that kept us from missing people. And so I think that value of people has not changed. We love people, and we're a big church, right? But I hear the stories all the time of people walking in the doors for the first time and they get scooped up, right? They weren't looking for us, but we were looking for them. And we got their name and we got their story, right? And we celebrate things as staff. We don't celebrate great program last night. We celebrate, man, this person, we met them and this is what God's doing in their life.
That's right.
And so I think we've deepened in that people matter. That people come first. And then I think we've actually grown in that to go, it's not just individual people, it's us as a people. We matter. And what God is doing in us matters. And so I don't know, I was just thinking earlier as I was taking notes, thank you, Bobby, that, what if we as a people were to reach and help one more person? all this would be worth it. And that's the beauty, I think, where God has taken us as a church.
Yeah, and it's consistent from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Mike and Chris beginning this little experiment of Porch City Community Church and being committed to what God might do.
Right.
When there was no guarantee. So today, to kind of pull all this together and for all of us to consider what we've learned today in our own life, I've got 2 questions for you. Bobby, you said Mike always gave practical questions at the end. So today, the 2 questions are, one is, what are the rocks in your own life? Where are the places that God has proved to be faithful in your past that he's calling you to remember? That he's calling you to take note of, that he's calling you to journal about a little bit, to bring other people into, to celebrate with you. And 2, in light of how God was faithful then, what might he be calling you to do now?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we wait till we've got all the answers, we've got the perfect strategy, we've got the perfect people on the bus with us. But what if it was, like, to your point, Javi, it's stepping out of the boat in faith. It's stepping toward what God is calling you to do, despite how much comfort it costs you.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the headlines of our church. And I think, Mike, next week, I'm excited to hear how you help us begin to look forward to the future and the faith that God's going to call out of our church in the future. Yeah. But this is where we started this morning in Joshua 4, verse 7. It says, "These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." And our prayer and our hope this week, as we celebrate the faithfulness of God over 25 years, is that we would identify the stones of our church and that we would commit them to being a memorial to the people of our church forever, to our kids who call Porch City home, to the people who occupy these walls and occupy these spaces 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now in a really, really beautiful way. And I'm expectant. Just like maybe you guys were in the basement that day watching Porch City Community Church slide across the ticker on the bottom of the screen, I'm expectant for what God's gonna do because of how faithful God has been to our church over the past 25 years. So to mark a moment to kind of create a stone for us today, to wrap up our time together, I wanna invite everybody to stand where you are. And you may not know the people standing beside you, but you're about to get to know them a little bit deeper. I'm gonna invite you to put your arm around the people around you because we are a people, we are a family. We wanna do life with God together for the world, and we're gonna pray together as a family. Doesn't it just feel right to embrace a complete stranger? But this is what it looks like for us to be the people of God that he is calling us into. God, we love you. And we just thank you for the beauty of this church. God, thank you for what our church cares about. God, thank you for the posture of our church to be helpful. God, thank you for Jesus and what he has given us and what he has demonstrated for us. And God, we just pray today that you would help us have an ability to identify the places that you have been faithful to us in the past. And God, I pray that we would be people of faith that take steps toward you in light of how so faithful you have been to us all along. And God, I pray for our church in this moment that we would just embrace you this week, that we would celebrate you this week in light of how faithful you have been to our church. And God, I pray that we would just continue to be a faithful church in the 25 years to come. So God, we love you, and we say all of this in your son's name. Amen.